Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SB Hall, and I'm your host. In today's episode on the Sagittarius Moon as the luminary out of Sect, I speak with the wonderful, talented, prolific astrologer Diana Rose Harper. In this conversation, we talk about both of our Sag Moons and also talk about a lot more. From the differences in our Jupiter and Cancer placements to the Antiscia relationship between Capricorn and Sagittarius, and also the myth of Artemis and Actaeon. But we also get into some sensitive topics, so here is a bit of a trigger warning. In particular, we talked about food and challenges related to food. So if those are sensitive subjects for you, I would proceed with that in mind. Before we dive into the conversation, I wanted to apologize to those waiting on the written transcript for episode 1. It's important to me that I make these conversations as accessible as possible, and I'm planning to have the transcripts for both episode 1 and 2 within the next couple of weeks. Also, in reference to accessibility, I edited this episode in, I think, significantly different ways from episode 1. As someone with auditory sensitivity, I view podcast editing as an accessibility issue as well. With that in mind, I would appreciate feedback on the work I'm doing here, especially from those that also have auditory sensitivities, so that I can make this podcast the best that it can be. But Diana and I had a great conversation, and I'm really grateful to her for taking the time to share her experience with me. Please be sure to check out the link to Diana's website below, as well as links to some of the resources that we touch on in our conversation. Hope you enjoy it. Diana Rose Harper, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. It's Moon Day with Moon in Scorpio, so
Some tough stuff.
that's I mean, it's not necessarily tough, but there's a pressure that the Moon in Scorpio always puts on. So
Yeah, I've been feeling that a little bit today myself, so I
Mm.
understand that. Well, thank
Yeah.
you so much for being with me today. I really appreciate you talking to me about your experience of your Sagittarius moon.
Yeah. I mean, it's not something I talk about that much, I feel like, but I don't know. Interesting to talk about, I would say.
Yeah, maybe we could get that into that a little bit more later when you talk about the placement of it, because you do have a whole lecture on
Uh-huh.
your
Yeah.
your sun and moon in your the Sagittarius house in your chart. But I was hoping that we could start with you giving a brief introduction to yourself.
Yeah. Well, I am somebody who is deeply interested in becoming a better human and becoming a human who manages more often than not to feel some amount of in love with being here and in love with the beings who share life with us here on Earth. And the primary modality that I use for that these days is astrology, but I also have a history with tarot and energy work and clinical massage therapy and a couple of other things that factor into my practices. I feel like that's I guess maybe another relevant thing is I'm getting used to or trying to how do I want to put this? I'm I'm of a collection of people who are identifying with the concept of relational astrology. Um, and that's a term that I first heard from my dear friend Pallas Augustine. And the idea is that it's an astrology rooted in relationality, and that relationality includes but is not exclusive to the concept of animism. Um, but very much about being in relationship with the planets and with the stars and with the more than human beings who share this place and space with us. So yeah.
I love that idea of relational astrology, and that emphasis and how that's, I'm pretty new to the astrology scene, but I feel like that's kind of maybe gaining some momentum right now.
Mhm.
More people kind of thinking about that concept. I think for anybody that's maybe new to astrology or doesn't know what animism is, do you mind giving just a brief description of that?
Yeah. So animism is a term that began to be used by basically white colonists. I believe it was really originated with white colonists interacting with the indigenous people of Australia.
Oh, wow.
But it's a term that only is necessary inside of a disenchanted worldview.
Mm,
Animism posits that the entire world is filled with consciousness and spirit. It's not only humans that have consciousness and spirit. And so, like the bush outside my window is an animate being within animism. The stone that I keep next to my bed is also a being in its own right, in their own right, whatever pronouns you want to use, right?
hmm hmm
Um, and whenever you're interacting with the world from an animistic perspective, you're interacting with a bunch of people. You're not interacting with dead objects, right? You're not objectifying the world. You are literally personifying the world. And it's not just an action of anthropomorphizing, it's also allowing more than human beings to have their own consciousness, their own personalities, their own ways of being, without centering and or placing at the top, like pedestalizing
mm
human consciousness and human personhood.
mm
So um, some people do call themselves like animistic astrologers or animist astrologers. And it was after a conversation that I had with Michael J. Morris that I pivoted more to thinking about relational astrology.
mm
Um, and that's in part because of the racist origins of the word
mm
animism and the racist concept of it. It's like, here are these primitive savages who believe that trees can talk or whatever. That's kind of where it comes from, this sort of racist ethnography.
mm
um Whereas relational is both broader and more specific at the same time, um because it's not just about saying that the planets are people, it's about relating with them as people.
mm
And then in client consultations or things like that, relationality is, prioritizing the relationship with the client versus the, um, I don't know, performance of knowledge on the part of the astrologer.
Yeah.
It's about sometimes showing clients the relationships that exist between things in the chart and how that
mm
relates with their own life, things of that nature. um yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that
Mhm.
that description. I feel like you took us through all the twists and turns with that, and I think it's really important to, with some of the words that can come up in the community or in these conversations, to know uh, the complex narratives around them.
Mhm.
So I think that that's really important. So thank you. The two things that come up in relation to these concepts are that things have a sense of autonomy and things
Mhm.
have a sense of subjectivity, so
Mhm.
kind of like the duality or uh the opposition of objectivity and subjectivity. I was reminded of that when you were
Mhm.
um describing that.
Mhm. I actually don't believe in objectivity. I don't think that
mm,
objectivity exists. I think everything is different levels of conscious subjectivity. I think when people claim objectivity, what they are claiming is a lack of awareness of their own worldview.
I love that. I think that it's very fitting that you say that, given what you said about relational astrology and animism. And I think it's really important to use language that's understandable, decipherable to most people. It's like most people don't have a understanding of classics and know that the root word of animism is anima, which means soul, and that means all things are ensouled, and
Hmm.
therefore all things have their own perspective.
Hmm.
And I'm reminded of like my philosophy studies in college and this idea of the view from nowhere, which is
Hmm.
touches base with this idea of objectivity, kind of trying to have this view of nowhere. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that we all come from a perspective. We all have a perspective. None of us has a view from nowhere. We can't
Exactly.
stand above.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And, I think there's also something that can be a little confusing about the phrase relational astrology because for people who don't operate in these sorts of spaces, they might misinterpret that to mean relationship astrology, specifically romantic relationship astrology, and compatibility and all of that sort of thing, which is not part of relational astrology because relational astrology is it's more like an ethic than a technique. It's not really a technique.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, just like one of my things, and I think we'll probably get into this because my moon rules my seventh house, and then my moon's ruler is in my seventh house. And so orienting relationally is my thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, and so there's something about um one of the things that I love doing is disrupting like very intentionally people's default of assuming that relationship means an exclusive monogamous heteronormative romantic relationship. Um like everything is a relationship. I think I even have a post on my Instagram that's basically everything is relationships because it it is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and relational
Mm-hmm.
astrology is just bringing forward the reality of those relationships and also trying to prioritize relationship and relationality as part of the method of interacting with astrology.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that. I
Mhm.
love that. And not to kind of harp on this point, but I do think it adds a real richness when looking at a chart and considering the relationships that certain planets may have to each other. I know that we're getting off topic, but the
Yeah.
relationships that certain planets may have to each other. For example, um, if you look at Sect alone and you look at the relationship of, say, Saturn and Venus, that may not, you may think of these planets as oppositional because they're on different Sect teams,
Hmm.
so to speak. But if you consider myths about Saturn and Venus, it's uh, you begin to wade into the complicated, a more complicated picture, a more nuanced
Hmm.
picture of the relationship that these two planets or these two beings
Hmm.
have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of relationships, shall we get into kind of like how we know each other and all that good
Yeah.
stuff?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the short version, the shortest possible version, is we met very close to an eclipse, and an eclipse that was right on top of our conjoined moons, and near my sun, near your moon, right? And then since then, we've just become extremely important. Like I would say, you're one of the most important people I have in my life.
Yeah,
So that's, I feel like that's the shortest possible version.
yeah, I
Yeah.
completely agree. You definitely play the same role in my life, and in terms of my astrological studies, you've also had a really important impact on me, and I just want to say thank you for that. And I just want to say that I appreciate you as a person and you as a professional astrologer as well. I think you add so much important. I think you add very rich, important details to the conversations that are going on. I'll say
Mm.
it that way. So
Oh, thanks.
you're very welcome. You're very welcome. Okay, so let's dive into our conversation more specifically about the moon. And so I wanted to break the ice a little bit in this conversation by kind of asking you about what your relationship to the moon was in your childhood. How did you think about it then? How did you feel about it then? How did you relate to it then? Or
Mhm.
what's one memory that comes to mind in relation
Yeah.
to the moon?
Well, I was born on a new moon, right? I was born a few hours after an exact new moon in Sagittarius. And my mom deliberately named me after a moon goddess, right? So I'm
Right.
not named Diana because it's a family name. I'm named Diana because of the Roman name for the goddess of the moon.
Mm.
So like literally I was greeted by the moon in a very explicit way at my birth, which I think is really interesting. Um, and then, I have that distinct memory. I think a lot of people have this experience of riding in the car and feeling like the moon
Mm,
is following you
yeah.
everywhere. Um, and the car is also an interesting thing because when I was really little, I don't have memories of this. When I was really little, my mom said that if I was fussy and I wouldn't fall asleep, she would just put me in the car seat and she would just
Same
drive
here.
around until I fell asleep. Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if that's a Sag Moon thing,
I
because there's
wonder.
something so, and like this has even happened with us, where it's like, we go for a walk or if we've been in the car at the same time, like some of the best conversations that we have and some of the most like comforting and nourishing interactions that we have happen when we're in motion.
Mm,
Um, so yeah, I would say though, that's like just knowing that I was named after a moon goddess. Um, I did really like the children's book Goodnight Moon when I was a
mm,
babe. um, and yeah, just like the car ride and the moon
mm.
being like right there, just like, why are you following me?
Yeah.
Like, is it because I'm named after you that you follow me everywhere?
Mm,
Like that kind of feeling.
that's so sweet. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another way that you can think about that, I think, is like the moon is your constant companion,
Mm-hmm.
which feels a little bit, I don't know, that feels really nice to me. This
Mm-hmm.
idea of like, saying goodnight moon before you go to bed, because like the moon is there with you.
Yeah. That's really interesting because as you say that, I feel like so it's like my sun and moon are 3 degrees apart. They're
Mm,
very close to each other. And that means that, my moon natally is not visible, just
right.
completely combust. But there's also something about that, the warm embrace of the sun,
Mm,
like to take it out of harsh, like technical, traditional delineation
right.
of, like my moon is very much in the embrace of the sun, is like still in the sun's, very much in the sun's presence,
Mm,
very much a companion to the sun. Like I can't really talk about my moon without talking about my sun, and I can't talk about my sun without talking about my moon.
right.
It's really interesting.
And
Hmm.
just to be clear, for the purposes of this podcast,
Hmm.
you technically have a diurnal chart.
Yes.
So you're born during the day.
Yes. I'm a Cap rising with a Sagittarius sun and moon. So my luminaries are both in
Mm,
the 12th whole sign house. Depending on the house system, sometimes my sun peaks into the 11th.
mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah.
Wonderful.
Hmm.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about the 12th house, I think, a little bit later. But I do want to kind of lay some groundwork first before we jump
Hmm.
right into the houses. So, what does the moon mean to you today? We talked about your relationship to it in your childhood. And why do you think it's important that we focus on the moon when talking about astrology? Or do you think it's important?
Oh yeah, extraordinarily important. So yeah, oh man, how do I think about the moon today? I mean, the moon is a guide and a lamppost. The moon is the body and its tendencies. The moon is the translation of light from one planet to another, even if they can't see each other by traditional aspect. The moon is the megaphone for the stars. Whenever the moon is conjoined a fixed star, like that's the time that you should go say hello.
Mm,
Um, the moon is the one who casts shadows in the winter across the snow, right? Like I have this distinct memory of being in Vermont in the winter of 2019, and the full moon on a really clear night, like literally casting shadows that are impossible to capture with, shitty iPhone camera, but that
mm,
are so present nonetheless. Um, the moon is a potentiator, right? Like the moon is
yeah.
a like Saturn has this, there's a phrase in the Thomas Taylor translation of the Orphic hymn of, obstetric, like Saturn having an obstetric nature, like Saturn being the one who pulls things into incarnate reality.
Mm,
But the moon is the one who gestates. right? The
Yeah.
moon is the materializer.
Mhm.
The
I love that.
moon, yeah, right. It's like
Yeah.
really cool. The moon is also like an inscriber in their own way. Like I know Mercury gets coded as like the scribe and the scholar and all of that, but as somebody who is a reluctant poet from time to time, against my wishes oftentimes, there's something about making something tangible, like the physical act of writing, like the physical, like handwritten thing is very lunar, even thinking about like talismanic image magic and astrological magic, where the moon is so crucial in those elections. And what you're doing is you're creating an image that should be in sufficient resonance with the astrological moment and the intention and the spirits that are involved, and that makes something manifest in the world. And it's very lunar. And then in astrology, like in a natal chart, the moon, yeah, the moon is the tendencies of the body. The moon is the tendencies of our emotionality. The moon brings us into direct relationship with anything and everything that waxes and wanes, right? It brings us into the waves of our energy cycles, the waves of our, physical cycles. It brings us into awareness of hunger and satiation. It brings us into trust that emotions come and go.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I mean, the moon can also help us to have clarity around what helps us feel safe
Mm.
and why safety is hard.
Right.
And I think that's really interesting and necessary.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know. That was a vibe. I don't know.
Yeah, that was a
Did I answer your
wonderful.
did I answer your question?
And then some, I think.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. And I feel like there's a million different directions we could go. I think two things. One thing I want to offer is because I feel for me, like I would like to develop a deeper relationship with fixed stars.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Um, and I feel like it's a bit of an occult subject, for lack of a better term. I was just wondering if you could offer any resources for people if they're interested in exploring fixed stars more, where they
Yeah.
might go.
Yeah. Amaya Rourke, who is Empress Craft on Instagram and Twitter, and I think empresscraft.com might
Yeah,
be
I'll
her
find her
website.
website and link it in the show notes for sure.
Yeah, she's brilliant. Such a deep researcher. And then the other person that I recommend is Sasha Ravich,
Okay.
who is Sasha Ravich and all of the places.
Mhm.
Um, she also has a really wonderful Patreon where she will share invocations to fixed stars, and there's a really active Discord with other people that are really into fixed stars. Like her fixed star work leans more towards the stars that are associated with the monstrous,
Mm.
which may or may not be what feels relevant for you personally, but it is extremely interesting and respect generating
Love
nonetheless.
that.
But yeah, those would be the two people I would most recommend. I believe Amaya, I don't know if she has it up on her website yet, but I know that she has in the past created like a primer on fixed star relationship. And that's something that, we co-taught a workshop last year on Venus retrograde in Capricorn,
Mm.
including some of the fixed stars that were implicated in that retrograde last year. And we included that document in the bonus materials. So I know
Mhm.
that it exists. I
Right.
just
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go check that out
Mhm.
soon too. Yeah, we'll definitely link all that stuff in the show notes. But
Mhm.
okay, thank you for that. The other thing that you said, which I think is really interesting, is this idea of the moon as the body. And
Mhm.
this idea, at least in traditional astrology, that not all the planets in a chart are necessarily the person whose chart it is.
Mhm.
And my moon in Sagittarius is in my first house. And there's this kind of idea of the planets in your first house representing the person, representing
Mhm.
the native, so to speak. And so I am curious if you can tell us a little bit about your experience of it as your body,
Mhm.
but being placed in the 12th house, in this so-called dark house.
Right. So, one of the ways that I've tried to explain the difference between, say, the ascendant and the moon, because the ascendant is also extremely descriptive of our body, like our physical being, in a
Mm-hmm.
really like intense way. And then, you look to the ascendant ruler for additional information about the literal physical body. Whereas the moon also gets related to the body, right? Like the moon is matter, like actual matter, but also matter like mater, like the mother. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and when I say the mother, I don't necessarily mean the social role of mothering, but the one within whom gestation occurs, understanding that gestation is holding and creating something,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that kind of matter, that kind of mother, not the like mom, but mom
Yeah.
gets related to the moon in various ways too. Um, Anyway, so the difference between the moon and the ascendant is the literal substrate that you're working with,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it's your tissue, your bones, whatever. But then the moon describes tendencies of that substrate.
Mm-hmm.
So this is how like a Cap rising like me with a Sag moon is going to have a different physical experience than a Capricorn rising with a Virgo moon or a Taurus moon or something.
Right.
Like the basic substrates remain Saturnian, but the tendencies differ based on the sign and the condition of the moon, sign house, whatever. So
Mm-hmm.
for me, like with a 12th house moon, um, it's off to the side. It's out of my peripheral vision. And so there's a lot of things that I have to very deliberately work to understand about my physical tendencies,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not immediately apparent to me what my tendencies are. The moon can also describe things related to our needs around like nutrition and movement and things like that. And again, it's in the 12th, so it's really easy for that to fall by the wayside for me. Like I have I don't know if like content warning talking
Yeah.
about food relationships, but
Mm-hmm.
it is so easy for me to forget to eat.
Yeah.
Right? Like I have to be very deliberate about being like, I'm going to have 3 square meals today. And when I am successful, I feel amazing. And I'm like, I should do this all the time. Do
Mm-hmm.
I do it all the time? No, I don't. And that
Yeah.
causes me physical unwellness, right? Because
Right.
when we don't feed our bodies regularly, our bodies go into stress modes. It's not just the hanger, it's also like cumulative stress over time. So it's like, if I'm experiencing a symptom, like I've had eczema since I was a kid.
Right.
And my flares come and go. Like I'm not in a flare right now, but like I know that when I'm approaching a flare, like it's because of stress and it's
Mm-hmm.
because of what I'm eating. And it can also be due to environmental factors. And one of my primary environmental factors is actually something I can't see, 12th house, which is certain forms of animal allergens,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, like, I recently went to go visit my grandparents. They have a cat. I also have a cat, right? But their cat, I'm more allergic to than my cat. And there are
Right.
factors that go into that. Like, their cat eats dry food almost exclusively. And if you feed your cat dry food, it increases the allergenic quality of the dandruff of,
Mm-hmm.
or, whatever the dander, that's what it's called, the dander of that
Yeah.
animal. Like with my cat, Milo, like when I first got him, he was addicted to dry food, like addicted. He like fiended after dry food. And it was such a task to wean him off of dry food and onto exclusively wet food.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever that happened, my allergic reaction to him decreased,
Okay.
right? It's like the super small invisible thing, but
Mm-hmm.
it affects my body quite immediately, or maybe sometimes not even immediately. Sometimes it's like, why am I having a tiny little outbreak? It's like, oh, like literally last week I had pizza with cow cheese on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Damn, you know? Um, but anyway, just like this experience of feeling kind of a disconnect from fully comprehending and fully being able to enact the tendencies or like attend to the needs of my body as described by that Sagittarius moon, by that moon that's like kind of burned up by the sun,
Hmm.
like to nourish my moon can sometimes be quite challenging.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about my own experience of my moon in my first and food. And yeah, not to get into it too much, but just to say, I have the opposite experience of you, I think,
Mm.
where I very seldom forget to eat.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know when I'm hungry and
Uh,
I'm eating often.
yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
like in the most extreme or stressed situations, I may not be able to eat or I may forget to eat, but it's the exception
Mm-hmm.
for sure.
Yeah. There are times when I literally don't even know that I'm hungry. And then like I'll maybe smell something or I'll start to eat because it's quote unquote time to eat. And it's when I'm starting to eat that I'm like, oh shit, I'm like starving.
Yeah.
I am so hungry right now. But
Yeah.
it's also really easy for me to like have like a little bite of something and for whatever reason my body registers that as like, oh, we ate
Mm,
when we had like a piece of cheese.
yeah.
Um and it's definitely, sort of that sensation of um being one's own enemy, one's own worst enemy, right?
Mm,
Or like insufficient clarity of communication, where it's just like, okay, the appetite has been smoothed, like the appetite is less sharp. That's not the same as being satiated.
yeah.
And that distinction can be quite challenging for me to be aware of.
Mm. I think I want to ask, and you don't have to get too personal. You can get as personal as you want to but
Hmm.
what have you found that's helped you to reconcile those things, to
Mm.
reconcile the the signals from being satiated?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things is just um I can't do quote unquote intuitive eating. If I did
Mm,
intuitive eating, I would just consistently undereat because that's what I
mm,
do whenever I'm just eating when I want to,
yeah.
what I want when I want. Like
Mm,
it's not functional for me. And so instead, what is functional is being like, I have to eat breakfast and lunch and dinner, period, full stop. And when I ensure that that is built into my schedule, then I eat consistently and I feel great. And um I'm more able to do stuff. Like whatever it is on my to-do list, I'm more likely to accomplish those things. It's just a matter of being like, I need to eat meals. Like I need to eat a meal before noon, I need to eat a meal in the early afternoon, and I need to eat a meal in the evening. Like
yeah.
that just is what it is. It's not about how I feel. Like whatever my hunger levels are will adjust how much I'm eating, right? But I just have to do that. I
Mm,
have to render it a non-option and not a vibes thing.
mm-hmm.
Basically. If I'm just eating based on vibes, like I'm fucked.
Yeah, it's funny. I have a Capricorn stellium. I think you do as well.
Yeah.
And but I feel like I'm going to mischaracterize Capricorn a little bit right now, and I just want to preface that this is not necessarily the universal experience,
Yeah.
but there does seem something Capricornian, Saturnian about it doesn't matter how I feel.
Yeah, no, absolutely, actually. And that's honestly really interesting that you bring that up because I feel like it doesn't matter what I feel or how I feel is another way to talk about like a 12th house moon,
Mm,
right? And like that phrase be like we can neutralize it, right? Or like make it neutral. Like if we say that it doesn't matter how I feel, like that can be neutral, but it can be applied so many different ways where it's like um like I think about some of the harder things that go along with having a 12th house moon. um like I was a foster care kid.
mm,
I'm a legal orphan
mm,
because I was removed from the legal custody of my parents, and where I went, who I ended up with, it didn't matter how I felt about it. It was just the structure that was being imposed on me, you know?
Yeah.
But then it's like now as an adult, it's like doing some self-parenting stuff where it's like, I don't care that you don't think you're hungry right now. It's mealtime.
Right.
Like, at least have a bite, at least have, half the plate,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what's good for you. It doesn't matter how you feel.
Right.
Or it's like it's a relative. It doesn't matter how you feel, right? Like, don't eat the things that you're allergic to that are going to make you break out in eczema in 2 days. But like, eat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In some of the spiritual circles I run with, there's this phrase of, which I don't necessarily feel good about, but feelings aren't facts.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's apropos here because
Mm-hmm.
it's not necessarily like, don't do what will harm you,
Mm-hmm.
but just because you feel a certain way does not necessarily mean that it's true.
Right.
And there does feel something very conversing with the inner child of that
Mm-hmm.
negotiation of like, just take a bite,
Oh,
eat
absolutely.
half the plate.
Yeah, just like go to the kitchen. Just go to the kitchen, look to see what's in the fridge. If you get a tummy rumble, eat. Yeah.
I feel like there's something also very Saturnian about this idea of timing.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
And
yes,
yeah, it's like so on the nose,
absolutely.
actually.
Yeah, like the structure of time. And I think about this too. It's like as a Capricorn rising, my second house is Aquarius. So it's like also ruled by Saturn. One of my most important resources, second house, is time, Saturn.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that makes whole sign aspect, like whole sign sextile to my 12th house Sagittarius. And one of the things that can actually be the most nourishing for Sagittarius planets is time, whether that
Yes.
be structured time or unstructured time, or just the spaciousness to do what you want with a given amount of time, or a judiciously edited schedule of some kind, like ideally a flexible schedule, right? But like a schedule nonetheless.
Mm-hmm.
Like that can be really, really conducive to Sagittarian energy enjoying itself,
Yeah.
like not just being productive or whatever, but like
Mm-hmm.
actually enjoying itself.
I love that you said that because very recently I was talking to my therapist and we were talking about the need for self reflection. Like,
Mm,
I'm about to move into my birthday is later this week. Um, there's a lot of things changing in my life. Generally, my birthday and the new year, I like take as a time for reflection, but it feels particularly important this year, which feels
mm-hmm.
also very apropos for Capricorn season.
Yeah.
Um, and we were talking about the importance of scheduling free time,
Mm-hmm.
scheduling fun time,
Yes.
scheduling time to just be with myself
Mm-hmm.
so that I could work things out and
Yeah.
don't have anything else to do but
Mm-hmm.
reflect.
Yes. And that's also very lunar. It's like nothing else to do but reflect. Like reflection is a super lunar thing. And so, you know, thinking additionally about um like lunar consciousness or whatever, and like its importance, there's I don't know. I don't really like pitting diurnal consciousness against nocturnal consciousness because they're both completely necessary.
Yeah.
And like last night, or like yesterday during my like solar devotions, had this really sort of beautiful reflection come forward. Actually, let me go grab that notebook so I can
Sure.
share that. Like I'm sure I'm probably gonna share something about this myself at some point. So
Mm-hmm.
like maybe this is even my solstice reflections. Like who knows? But there's this, like, we have this reputation of diurnal consciousness as being like really like overbearing, and it blots out everything else, and it's like blah 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 blah. And I feel like that's giving the sun a single note to play.
Mm-hmm.
But the sun every single day is a different version of itself. And even the sun at a single moment is an infinite number of versions of itself. It's being received in infinite number of ways on the entire globe, right?
Yeah.
Wherever it's daylight, some people are going to be having more or less daylight because of their closeness or for like distance from the equator. Maybe there's cloud cover, maybe there's weather happening, maybe there's elevation changes. Like,
Mm-hmm.
like the sun, I don't know why I'm going on this like solar thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it feels important because it's like the sun is seen as a single note until it's been refracted through something,
Mm-hmm.
right? Sunlight refracted through a prism becomes the visible spectrum of color,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like the sun's light contains that multiplicity and then generates that multiplicity by like allowing plants to photosynthesize, right? Like
Right.
without the sun's light, like the sun in the sky might obliterate the stars,
Mm-hmm.
right? We can't see the other stars. But also without the sun's light, we don't have the diversity of life on this planet,
Right.
right? Every single alive thing on this planet is expressing the consequences of solar energy,
Mm-hmm.
right? So anyway, that's like get more interesting in your understanding of diurnality rather than just shitting on diurnality.
Yeah. It reminds me
Um,
of a conversation I had with conversation like a Twitter back and forth I had with Hawk, who
uh-huh.
Hawk said something and I responded like, "Oh, how very diurnal of you." I don't remember exactly what they said.
Yeah,
And they were like, "Yeah, it's a solar system," which is
exactly.
very important
It's
to
it's
remember.
a solar system. We don't have the system without the sun,
Right.
right? Anyway, that like but I think about this too because it's like again, I can't think about my moon without thinking about my sun because they're fused in my chart,
Right.
and so one of the ways that I understand combustness is that the sun intakes that planetary energy and
Mm,
expresses it through itself.
right.
So my solar self is my lunar self.
Right.
I cannot separate them.
Mm-hmm.
My lunarness is expressed through my solarness.
Right.
um And I forget why I started talking about this.
That is okay. I think you were going to share something from your notebook.
Right. I mean, well, it's basically that idea,
Mm,
right? Of just
yeah.
like, I'm not going to share exactly what I have here.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
If you do remember,
but
I would love to hear what you have to say, but you also brought up a really interesting thought, which
yeah.
we didn't talking about in this conversation, but I
Mm,
think it's important given the fact that you're talking about your Capricorn ascendant,
mm,
how that relates to the self, and we're talking about the moon and how that relates to the self,
mm,
and you're talking about this solar idea or this idea in astrology that relates to the solar of Antiscia and
mm.
this Antiscia relationship between Capricorn and Sagittarius.
Yeah.
And I bring this up because I know that you were maybe thinking about doing some work with Antiscia. And I was hoping that maybe you could tell us a little bit more what you feel like that relationship means between Sagittarius and Capricorn. Because for
Yeah.
me, I think of, I have a Sag rising, my chart ruler, or I'm sorry, not my chart ruler, my ascendant rulers in Cancer. And so they're contra Antiscia. And that's
Hmm.
kind of can be described as like a reluctant conjunction. I kind of get what that means.
Yeah.
Antiscia is a little bit harder for me to
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah. So I actually have a perfect Venus moon Antiscia,
Mm,
which I think is really interesting.
yeah.
And my name is Diana Rose.
It's perfect.
Loud blinking. Um,
Yeah.
um, but I understand Antiscia. Antiscia is about shared quantity of light,
Mm,
right? And so there is this like the structuring of the sun becomes important. So it's like, my moon is at a degree of the zodiac that has the same amount of daylight during, like if we're using the solar calendar,
mhm,
as my Venus's degree. So when the sun is at 21 degrees of Capricorn and when the sun is at 9 degrees of Sagittarius, there's the same amount of daylight in
mhm,
that on those days.
mhm.
And that shared luminosity is this like really beautiful, I don't know, like I think of it as like um when you meet somebody who has equal enthusiasm for something that
Mm,
matters to you,
mm.
like there's an
Yeah.
equal amount of like vibrant connection around something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's really interesting because I think in kind of most delineations of Antiscia I've seen, it's equated to equal power. This idea
Mm-hmm.
of the day as being the same length, the
Yeah.
same amount of light.
The same amount of luminosity. Yeah. There, I mean, I guess I also think about it. And this is interesting. It's an interesting and also challenging topic to cover or to touch on, I think. But to meet someone who's on your level would maybe
Mm-hmm.
be one way of putting it. Um, or like to be in relationship with someone who's on your level, that's like the Antiscia relationship.
Yeah.
And like where however you want to think of on my level, like, like watching I was watching Too Hot to Handle recently, and it's terrible.
It's so
And
silly,
it's
but it's so
so
good somehow.
it's so terrible and bad. Um,
By
you know,
good, I
'cause
mean I get sucked into it. It's not
it's
actually really that good.
it's entertaining and horrifying.
Yeah.
And like as a relationally oriented person, like the way that I want to like reach through the screen and like shake all of these babies, I'm
Mm-hmm.
just, but there was one couple or whatever where it was really clear that one part of the couple was on one emotional level and the other was like really has quite a lot of catching up to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be the like that's not Antiscia,
Right.
right? Like they're not on the same level in terms of like emotional maturity and emotional preparedness for
Mm-hmm.
something. So yeah, it's like my moon and Venus, they vibe
Right.
hard, which is
Mm-hmm.
interesting because I do have a diurnal chart,
Mm-hmm.
and these are two of the three night sect planets.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, I don't know if we need to like spend too much time there, but
No, I think that
it's interesting.
there's something about they're on my level
Mm-hmm.
that really clicks for me.
Mm-hmm.
That equal power did
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily make click. Like that is something that we think about in relationships a lot, whereas like
Mm-hmm.
power is not necessarily something I maybe
Power is
try to
hard.
think about.
Power is harder to think about because of how corrupted the concept of power is in at
Absolutely.
least American culture. So,
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about your moon and what that means to you, your relationship of your moon and your sun, its placement in your 12th house. So why don't we add in now the sign that it's in? So what does Sagittarius mean to you, and what does it mean for you for the moon to be in Sagittarius?
mm-hmm. Yeah. So whenever I talk about signs, and anybody who's been in class with me has heard me talk about this, I really like to build it up from the modality, the element, and the planetary ruler. And
Mm,
then, at that point, I'll also, incorporate relevant mythologies and things like that. But I really like to start with the mode and the element as like the most fundamental components. And so when I think
mm-hmm,
about Sagittarius, I think about mutable fire. And I've been relatively slowly, working on like having sort of tangible examples
mm-hmm,
for all of the signs over time. And with Sagittarius, mutable fire, this is not just moving fire, right? This isn't the flamethrower of Aries,
mm-hmm,
right? But it's fire that adapts. And so one of
mm-hmm,
the things that I think about with mutable fire as a real world poetic tie, I guess,
mm-hmm,
is the coal that you carry from one campfire to another, and then the
mm,
campfire itself,
yeah.
right? And like I know that you talked a little bit about nomadicness with Sagittarius in the previous Sag Moon episode with Aaron.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Um, and that's like a really operative, I think, for Sagittarius and like Sagittarian fire, that mutable fire, that movable fire is, do you have a way to carry your fire with you, understanding that your fire is not attached to like the hearth of a particular place and
mm-hmm.
isn't something that you're throwing anywhere, right?
Yeah.
Or, it's not the rocket fuel where there's like a single purpose.
Mm-hmm.
that you get with Aries, or the got to maintain the flame in one place of Leo, that sort of steady state
Mm-hmm.
sun.
Mm-hmm.
It's how do you bring fire with you, and how do you also kind of share fire and adjust fire too? Because like, a campfire can be as small as something really tiny, just enough to boil some water over. It can also be a bonfire,
Yeah.
right? And between those two, there's different variants of that being shared. Like, I think a lot about travelers or campers, like especially like through hikers and things like
Mm-hmm.
that, and how special it can be to sit with people that you wouldn't meet in any other circumstance. And the
Right.
thing that's bringing you together is this light in the darkness,
Mm-hmm.
this heat, this place that nourishes and where stories really unfold. Like, I think, like, I love The Hobbit, right?
Yeah,
Like,
me
I
too.
grew up reading The Hobbit. I know, yeah, I know you did too. And when you read The Hobbit, especially as compared to The Lord of the Rings, like The Hobbit, when I read it, I feel like I'm hearing like a Gandalfian figure reading it aloud to me.
Mm.
Right? There's very much this is something to be read aloud. There's something poetic in the storytelling, right? A story that is meant to be heard versus just consumed, you know? Like, that's that mutable fire of Sagittarius. That's the thing, that it happens around the campfire, right?
Mm.
Or um it happens in an exchange moment. Like, I also think about like taverns, and
Yeah.
like historical taverns. Like, there's this great book, was it the Castle of Cross Destinies, I think is what it's called, by Italo
Okay.
Calvino. And it's about this tavern where everybody's like, there's people from all different levels of society, and they're sharing stories with one another. They're actually building stories with one another, and that feels very
Mm.
Sagittarian to me. Like,
Mm.
the sharing of your own light, but also how that is inside of the invitation of a conversation, just being
Yeah.
like, what do you think? Like, what is your orientation? And like, this kind of brings us then into Jupiter as the ruler of Sagittarius, who's, he's the temperer, he is the meaning maker. um Jupiter expands our capacities to navigate things, and part of that expansion of capacities is like perspective, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
the expansion of your own personal perspective that comes from your own personal experiences, but then there's the perspective shift that comes from hearing other people's experiences, right? And that also feels very much like a campfire conversation to
Mm.
me.
Yeah.
That sharing of experience, that sharing of perspective of like, have you ever been through that past? Like, oh man, a couple years ago, blah, 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 blah. This year, though, I just wanted to let you know that blah, 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 blah. And that gives you perspective that affects where you're going to go as you
Right.
move forward from that meeting point.
Mm.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
that's things I think about with Sagittarius.
Yeah. A few things come to mind. One is this idea of gathering around the campfire. And as a child, we went on rafting trips a few
Mm-hmm.
summers with our extended family. And I remember sitting around the campfire with everybody, and it really is this gathering place with people you may not necessarily meet with otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that the word primal has come to carry some odd connotations or maybe challenging connotations. Similarly, how I feel about the word nomadic.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember being a child and or being a teenager and sitting around the campfire and really feeling like the connection to prehistoric humans,
Mm-hmm.
which is most of human history. Most of
Yeah.
human history, we've as a species existed for about 200,000 years. And what we consider as quote unquote civilization
Mm-hmm.
is like maybe the last 6,000 years, something
Right.
like that.
Side note on that, a resource to drop in, there's an episode of the Emerald podcast that
Mm.
goes into that in a really beautiful way. But
Oh,
keep
cool.
going.
I'd love to
Yeah.
listen to that. Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll drop that in for sure. I think that that kind of prehistoric human configuration of society, for lack of a better term, does feel very Sagittarian to me,
Mm-hmm.
which connects to kind of that idea of uh, pre-settler humans. And
Mm-hmm.
there also feels something very Sagittarius can be at its extreme kind of characterized as like the zealot, like the religious zealot. But I think that for me, I feel this strong association with egalitarianism with
Mm-hmm.
Sagittarius, and that really resonated with talking about Italo Calvino and the tavern, and this idea of people from different stations and
Mm-hmm.
walks of life coming together and learning this kind of Sagittarius word from each other in a way that they would not be able to learn otherwise if they did not have this kind of cross reference of
Mm-hmm.
conversation, conviviality, fire, for
Mm-hmm.
lack of a better term.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something about, you know, people will sometimes use the language of evolved and unevolved for the signs, which I hate every
Mm,
single application of the word evolution to something that isn't inside of the biological sciences.
yeah.
It really rankles me, which is part of honestly why it can sometimes be hard for me to engage with evolutionary astrology
Mm,
conversations,
mm-hmm,
because there's a lot of richness and meaning and insight inside of EA, and it's like I feel very blocked around the application of the word evolution
mm-hmm.
outside of like species biology. Um
Right. How do we
anyway,
talk
that's
about growth? Because what we're
growth or
really doing is
change.
growing and changing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Evolution is this
exactly.
species level thing that
Exactly.
happens.
And just like this implication that evolution is better
Right.
when evolution is just adapting to circumstances. And which was really interesting too, because like that's something that I relate with Sagittarius. Like Sagittarius is adaptable, right? If you are
Mm,
going to be relatively nomadic, that's an adaptability thing. You have to be able to be equipped to deal with whatever circumstances you're facing,
mm-hmm,
right? And to be in this direct interaction with like the raw, like not human, human, I don't know, contained nature,
yeah.
right? Like if you're nomadic, you're facing the elements, right? There's
Mm-hmm,
something about the quote unquote wildness and like the wilderness and like the
mm-hmm,
respect for the wilderness and the understanding of what does it mean to be in right relationship with the wilderness that has kind of been sanitized out of a lot of, American culture.
mm,
Um like survivalism is about how much food can you store,
right.
or like, do you have fancy knives? I mean, there are people who are more authentic in their survival skills, but it gets kind of weird and consumerist versus like deeply respectful of
Mm-hmm,
the wild places,
mm,
and even just thinking about how Sagittarius has been reduced from like a chimeric, um, kind of fear inducing beast to a bow and arrow. Like it's not
right.
even a person wielding a bow and arrow, right? It's like removing even the possibility that this is a weapon, like the bow and arrow is a weapon. It is a hunting tool,
Mm-hmm,
right? It is a war tool.
right.
It is a tool of defense as well. But the bow and arrow is being carried by an archer, the
Mm-hmm,
archer who can aim that arrow, who has intelligence. And that archer, the second half of that archer is a horse, is a beast, and not just any beast, but one of the most intelligent and muscular animals that humans are in active relationship with.
mm-hmm,
And, I think about human proximity to our animal natures. It's like we're recording this podcast in the comfort of our own homes with like climate control and electric lights. And, I have a
mm-hmm,
cup of tea that I boiled the water that came out of the tap on my stove, right? Like I didn't have to work hard for this. And so there's a distance from the animality of Sagittarius. And one of the interesting things is people will be like, oh, yeah, it's bestial, but it's also very philosophical, as though those things
mm,
are paradoxically not tied to one another.
absolutely.
Like I was just talking with someone I know who works inside of the realm of embodiment practice,
Mm-hmm,
and one of the things that we were talking about, it's like, that IQ bell curve thing. Like, I know
Yeah.
you made a really funny meme version of that for Santa Claus. It's great. Um, but there is so much wisdom in our bodies, right? There is so much knowledge. There's so much survival understanding and philosophical orientation and belief and like insight that is in our literal animal tissue. And when we
Mm,
engage with our instincts in a deep way, we can come into more respect around that. But if we're never forced into our instincts,
mm,
it's easy to pretend that the body is dumb, that animals are dumb, that animal nature is stupid. I'm reminded too of, several years ago, I took trapeze classes. I was in my university circus, but it was only after I was done with college and had a job that actually paid me money that I could
mm,
afford trapeze classes. And one of the most astounding experiences, this was, I don't know, maybe like week 2 or 3 of trapeze class. And I'm on a bar that is tall enough that when I'm just in a dead hang from the bar, there's like a solid, 5 feet below me or something.
mhm,
And I'm doing a trick from this bar, just like a very simple trick. And I slip a little bit and my body catches me. My body knows what to do
mm,
while my mind is freaking the fuck out. And
mm,
like that experience like brought me so like I had respect for the body, like whatever. Yeah, man, like the body's so cool. Like we got blah 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 blah. I did not actually respect my body until that moment.
mm.
Right? Like our instincts are so important. And like that's part of why it's so important to do nervous system work, which like I think
Right.
that Jupiter assists with nervous system capacity. Right. The nervous system itself is like sort of a internal belief system. That's Aquarius. Is like a message system. That's Gemini. But in terms of like what facilitates that nervous system feeling resourced and trusting that there's adaptability and circumstance, that's Jupiter, especially Sagittarius, because of the like movement quality versus the kind of sitting in the stew quality of Pisces.
Mm,
And we have to give our systems sufficient trust and belief and like all of that sort of thing to navigate life well, but that includes being in that relationship with our instincts and to be able to differentiate between a genuine animal instinct and a tightened nervous system survival response.
mhm,
So like to me that's very Sagittarius, of to be able to explore difference, to be able to interact with people who have different experiences from you, to understand what is possible for you, and to have that bring you into more relationship with aliveness, including the aliveness of being a human, which is to be an animal,
mhm.
and the depth of wisdom that comes from just like being a human animal,
Yeah.
and like not running away from being a human animal,
Mhm.
not pretending that being a human animal puts you above other animals, and also understanding that being a human animal comes with responsibilities to other animals.
Yeah, you've said so many rich things, and I think the one thing I want to say before we move on to talk about Jupiter and Jupiter's role in your chart is I think that people can say we're just animals with a kind of fatalism, which I think that you talked about. And I think that the wisdom of Sagittarius is to be able to say that we are animals with a sense of deep respect and wonder at what it really means to be an animal, all the
Yeah.
wisdom that animals need to
Hmm.
survive and thrive.
Yeah, exactly. And this is just reminding me one thing that's interesting about centaurs,
Mm,
which, the vast majority of centaurs were considered to be like brutish and cruel and barbaric and like all of that sort of thing. The hordes of centaurs galloping across the plains, just like
mhm,
slicing and dicing and raping and pillaging and all of that kind of thing. Like, the reason why centaurs are scary are not because they are more animalic than humans, it's because they have the power of the animal combined with the cunning of the human. And in a lot of the stories, there's also this sense that subtracted from them is a respect for sociality,
Mm.
or a respect for at least, the sociality of those who consider them to be barbaric, right?
Yeah.
Like we can talk about different cultural norms here
Mhm.
for sure. Um, but it's like whenever there's human intellect and animal strength without heart, that's where we find cruelty.
Yeah. I'm finding my brain really wanting to go to this idea of speciesism
Uh-huh.
and how that intersects with a lot of other isms that we have.
Mm-hmm.
But I do feel like that would be quite a digression, but I do
Yeah.
feel like that is very, very fitting, I
Mm-hmm.
think, and kind of speaks to the idea of Sagittarius as kind of, in one way, representative of this kind of moving nomadic consciousness
Mm-hmm.
compared to, in this kind of story of the centaurs versus whomever the other group was. Let's just say humans for this example, the settled,
Mm-hmm.
the relying off of the surplus,
Mm-hmm.
the creation of walls and gates and all of these kinds of things that have become common in human life.
Right. And it's like the things that protect humans that are settled often harm other animals,
Right.
right? Like
And
thinking
harm
about,
humans.
and they harm humans too, right? Like
Yeah.
thinking about like the shipping containers that are being like put along the new American Mexico border, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, so you're keeping out people who are trying to enter this country. You are also like disrupting migration paths of other beings
Right.
who need that, who like don't believe in borders, one, and two are literally harmed by physical borders.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Again, speciesism. It's just like the priority of a particular class of humans, like about keeping out another class of humans, like xenophobia,
Right.
then also being like, oh yeah, and that's so much more important than the migration paths of these creatures who we actually rely on,
Mm-hmm.
but who we don't hire to do anything, and so we don't perceive that we rely upon them.
Right. Yeah. With that, I think it would be good to move to talking more about Jupiter.
Mm-hmm.
And you've kind of touched on that quite a bit already. But if there's anything else that you want to say about Jupiter in your chart, your relationship to Jupiter,
Mm-hmm.
what it means for it to be in the seventh house in Cancer, exalted.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. I mean, Jupiter's Bay, right? Like Jupiter
Mm,
is literally the planet in my seventh house. Like Jupiter's in a very tight opposition with my ascendant ruler Saturn. Jupiter is in charge of, like responsible for my sun, my moon, and my Mercury. Um, Jupiter is well resourced in Cancer and in contra Antiscia with its ruler, the moon. And yeah, I mean, like when I think about Jupiter, I think about like the Dagda from Celtic mythology,
mm-hmm.
who like his name translates directly to the good god. And my favorite little bit of mythos around the Dagda is, he has this giant cauldron that's always filled with stew.
Mm-hmm.
He has this capacity to feed whoever comes to him in need.
Mm-hmm.
And in some stories, the Dagda is the parent, like the father of Brigid. And one of Brigid's forms is Brigid the hosteler, right? Like hospitalier. For some reason, I understand the word in French, but I can barely
Yeah.
understand it in English. But she's like caring for those who are traveling,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there's also a variant of Brigid of the cowless, right? She advocates for those who do not have property,
Mm-hmm.
so that they might not be abused simply because they don't have property.
Right.
There's so many good Bridget stories,
Mm-hmm.
but like I think about the Jupiter. I think about Jupiter and I think about generosity, and like part of why I really like the Dagda, I think, is because like Jupiter in Cancer is like wants to feed people.
Yeah.
Jupiter in Cancer is like everybody comes to the feast and nobody's going to leave the table hungry. It's really beautiful. And it's like, I don't know, like that's one of the things that I've missed most throughout the Panini Press, and honestly for even longer than that, because it's been a while since I've lived in circumstances where I can have people over for meals, but like I remember in college and like a little bit after college, like throwing brunches or dinners was like huge. Like I even remember my college best friend Lucy, she was about to go on study abroad in the Middle East. And before she left, we like threw her this like going away feast. And it's the first time I made and roasted a leg of lamb. It was the most expensive food item I had ever purchased at that point. It was like $80. It was huge. And that's so delightful to me. Like I know that Libra gets a lot of whatever for being a host, but Jupiter's the one who joys in the 11th, like the place of like communal gathering. And Jupiter in Cancer, I don't know, like, well, one thing that's interesting about Jupiter in Cancer in my 7th is I've been very, very fortunate to fall in love several times. And I've also been through the experience of very enormous heartbreak. And there's something about Jupiter in Cancer that's like believing in the possibility, right? Like wherever, if you're someone that has Jupiter in Cancer, wherever that lands, there's this belief in the possibility of insert house meaning here, right? Yeah. And that's a belief that is tested, right? Like Jupiter in Cancer is like, yeah, it's exalted, but that exaltation also means really fucking big feelings. Right. And it's not a belief that's just like, yeah, everything's going to be great. Everything's always been great. It's a belief that's been tested, right? It's like, can you believe this even when you've been pushed really far outside of your comfort zone, even when you've been pushed outside of your preferences? And so, when I think about my Jupiter in Cancer, like resourcing, like in charge of my moon in Sagittarius, there is something about how, like, one of the most important things that I've learned in terms of being in relationship with myself is to actually give myself the room to feel my big feelings. Because I can have shame around some of my feelings, even when they're really positive, like for a long time. And this remains true. Like gratitude is the most overwhelming feeling for me. And I've had to increase my tolerance for it because, gratitude, like I feel like gratitude, when it emerges for me, it like grabs me by the throat and it like pushes me onto the floor, and it's a very positive feeling. And it's also like immobilizing for me. Like, I remember a couple of years ago, this was so sweet. This was in 2020. 2020 was a terrible year in a lot of ways, but it was a terrible year for me personally. And it was kind of the first year that I was like open on social media about like, hey, my birthday often sucks. I have a 12th house sun. So my birthday season is my 12th house sun season, right? And it would be really meaningful to receive some gifts. And so I like made myself a little Amazon wish list and people sent me things.
Wow.
And as these packages were arriving, I was just like rendered catatonic with gratitude. There's this interesting relationship between my luminaries and Jupiter where it's like, if I want the relationships that I want, I have to be seen, and being seen is really fucking scary. It's like, I would like to keep myself mostly private. It's like I can be a very open book in a lot of ways, but it's like I'm really deliberate about what I share publicly. And even if there's somebody I like who is like actively seeing me being actively seen, I'm like, I'm gonna go hide in my eternal shell. Do not observe me. My pronouns are who, where. Don't talk to me. Right. And so there's this real tension. And it's like part of it is the big feelings. It's like I have these big feelings and I don't want anybody to see my big feelings. So I'm going to go be in my turtle shell. And also when I let my big feelings be seen and held by people that I'm in trusting relationship with, there's nothing that feels better than that. It's this real, like there's something very curious with, I think, Jupiterian experiences. And this is something, over the past couple of weeks, I've been leading this thing called By Jove, which is just like a 4-week fairly simple but like deliberate engagement with some Jupiterian virtues and Jupiterian attunement. And people in the Discord, like even commenting of just like, wow, I did not expect there to be this much like baggage around these concepts for me. I did not
Mhm.
expect these apparently positive things to feel so complex and even bad, you know? And I think that's one of the things like with Jupiter in Cancer is just like, yeah, the feelings are really big and they're going to be really uncomfortable, but actually engaging with them is very nourishing,
Yeah.
you know?
Mhm. Yeah, I relate to a lot of that. And yeah, I wanted to say in reference to Baijiu, I was doing the your growth meditation right before we started recording because I'm
Yeah.
doing Baijiu, and it's been really helpful for me to reconsider my relationship with Jupiter. I feel like I have a good relationship with Jupiter,
Hmm.
always all these relationships are always living and growing, but I do feel like I have a good relationship with Jupiter, but it's been really nice to really intentionally spend time to consider that within like this kind of community of other people doing the same things and talking about their
Hmm.
own experiences because I think about your Jupiter and Cancer in the seventh, and I was thinking about this earlier today, how the day of my birth was the day of your first lunar return, and I don't think I realized that before, right?
That's wild. I have never thought about that before.
Yeah, it's quite cool. I really I don't know. I don't know why it came to me before we started recording, but I was just struck by the fact that that is the case because we're just a month apart about.
Yeah. Wow, that is breaking my brain right now.
All that's to say, we have a very similar Jupiter placement, but
Yes.
Jupiter, just like your moon in Sag is in the 12th and my moon in Sag is in the first, my Jupiter is not in the seventh, but in the eighth. And so I relate a lot to big feelings and
Yeah.
navigating, for me,
Mm.
sometimes very challenging emotions. And I think the thing that's hard for me is like, I can really understand why gratitude would feel hard.
Hmm.
I think the thing I've come back to, and I really love this idea of like you said, the Jupiter experience and thinking about the nature of Cancer and something about like the moon's rulership of dreaming, the moon's rulership of cycle, like being very cyclical, and this idea of like, I don't know, sometimes you really need to work on things over time. There's this like almost
Hmm.
trial and error component where it's like, I think with my own ability to feel my feelings, the most challenging thing is sadness. And interestingly, it's like this fear of being drowned by sadness, by
Hmm.
being over what feels very Cancerian, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but I think as I lean into that fear, into that experience of submerging, because it is a very big feeling, and learning that the tide will ebb and flow, and it won't take me, but it will wash over me and recede. I've been able to learn how to be more present with my emotions.
Hmm.
But I do want to say that as like, yeah, as a person kind of socialized to be a man in the society where we're in, where men generally aren't allowed to have feelings, that's also been a very challenging thing of navigating, like being a very emotional person, being a very kind of lunar person, having Jupiter in Cancer, and learning how to trust myself and protect myself and still be real, still be authentic.
Yeah. One thing that I think is really interesting that what you were saying was reminding, like, kind of pointing towards is, it's like we both have angular Jupiter situation and lunar Jupiter situation. It's like
Mm-hmm.
my angular Jupiter and then my uh, Sagittarian moon that's not angular. You with your angular Sagittarian moon and your Jupiter, which is not angular. And one of my experiences is people often don't know when I'm having an emotional experience because it's in my 12th house, it's hidden.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, you have, I think, the opposite, like, quote
Yeah.
unquote, problem where it's like, you'll just be like in line at the grocery store thinking about something and you get all misty eyed. you know,
Yeah.
like your emotions are so immediately apparent and mine aren't. It's like I have that Capricorn like wall
Right.
that it can be quite challenging to have both the Capricornian like wall of that ascendant but also the moon in the 12th, because like I know that there are people who think I'm intimidating or
Mm.
harsh or whatever, and it's because it's hard to visibly see the emotions that are going on for me.
Yeah.
They're not there, they're just like not on display.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that that's really an apt reflection of that. So, how do considerations of myth play into your understanding and experience of both the moon and the sign of Sagittarius?
That's interesting. So actually, so thinking about what I was just saying before about like my emotions aren't super visible, or, there's kind of a, if you see this, it's because you're in proximity with me, you're in relationship with me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was thinking about like the myth of Artemis and Actaeon,
Okay.
actually. Um, and, Artemis is, the Greek goddess of the moon. She's a young goddess, and she's one of the goddesses that are granted permission, quote unquote, to remain virgins, to remain unmarried.
Mm-hmm.
And she's not just a goddess of the moon, she's a goddess of wild places and wild animals and childbirth and like forest plant medicine and like a whole bunch of things like that. And so in this mythology, this like story with Actaeon was like one of the finest hunters of like a local prince or something.
Mm-hmm.
He's like has his hunting dogs and his bow and like whatever, he does all this manly hunting stuff. And one day he's hunting in the woods, he's hunting a stag, and he comes across Artemis and her coterie of nymphs bathing in a forest pool.
Mm.
And he lingers a little too long and he's caught.
Ooh.
And Artemis is wrathful. It's like,
Mm.
I did not give you permission to witness me, to observe me in this way. And because you have lingered too long, you have been, it's kind of a form of hubris to think that you're not going to get caught by
Mm.
a goddess. You're fucked, man. Like, she's just like, fuck you.
Mm-hmm.
And she turns Actaeon into a stag,
Mm.
who is then ripped to shreds by his own hunting hounds. Right? It's quite intense, right? This punishment of the divine, but also the punishment for seeing something that you were not invited to see.
Mm.
And, I was thinking about this earlier because, I knew that talking about myth would be something that we put in this conversation. And like, I relate really strongly with that sensation of, I did not give you permission to see this.
Mm.
And you pushed a boundary that you knew you were
Mm-hmm.
not supposed to cross. You were
Mm-hmm.
dead to me. Like, that is very much a feeling I have around like my, like that. I feel like that's part of my lunar nature of having certain kinds of privacy, right? Like, yeah, I will share certain things
Mm-hmm.
publicly, but like there's a lot of things, like the vast majority of my life is not something that I want other people to have access to,
Yeah.
right? Like it's not like it's I need my privacy. I need that retreat. Like
Mm.
that's in part also a 12th house thing. Like I need my alone time. Like I need to feel the separation from the center of things as
Mm-hmm.
part of how I nourish and restore myself. And to feel like people are invading on that
Mm.
is, oh, it makes me livid.
Yeah.
Livid. It's the quickest way to get blocked by me, actually,
Mm. Mm.
is to pretend a familiarity I have not consented to.
Yeah. That does feel very, very moon in the 12th, very
Mm-hmm.
fitting for that placement.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminds me of, I studied philosophy in college and I took a class called The Morals and Politics of the Lord of the Rings. And we talked about this idea of the piacular, which means basically breaking some kind of sacred
Mm,
oath, or like
breaking a taboo.
crossing a line. Breaking a taboo that you don't necessarily know you've broken, that you've
Yeah.
broken in ignorance. And it reminds me of that part of the story where Gollum is bathing in, and I can't believe the Lord of the Rings heads are going to come for me for this, but I can't remember the name of the pool. But
Uh,
it's a pool that's sacred to the men of Gondor,
mm-hmm,
and he bathes in it. And there's this idea of like the piacular and the breaking of the sacred,
mm-hmm.
which really I feel like resonates with this idea of, you know, you see a maiden bathing naked. It's like I feel like it is kind of the respectful thing to do is to avert your eyes. That should be common knowledge to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so this is maybe not applying super well, but
Yeah.
you don't, I guess, you don't think that the repercussions of that are going to be transfiguration and dismemberment.
Right.
Um,
Right. And I think there's also something quite, you using the language of transfiguration and dismemberment then, brings us into, like what, like another, so like Artemis has like interesting epithet relationship with like Cybele, the lady of the
mhm,
beasts,
mm,
the ruler of the beasts. And then, if we're thinking about transfiguration and dismemberment, we can think a little bit about Dionysus
right.
and like the
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 Maenads.
drunken the drunken fervor of wildness, which we can then relate also then to Sagittarius again. But also there's something about like to be so fortunate as to see a god in the wild.
Mm,
What other consequence could there be than an utter transformation and the rending of yourself,
mm,
right?
right.
Like there's also the story of like Zeus and Semele, right? Who Semele who insists on seeing Zeus in his full deity, his full divinity,
Mhm,
and she is incinerated
yeah.
by a consequence of that. And so like I think about like the psychological components of like having the moon and the sun in the 12th
Mhm,
house. It's like this is the house of subconsciousness, right? It is a house of dreams and their interpretation of symbolic language and non-rationality. And there is something quite important to my ongoing lived experience of witnessing, of being struck by, like not going to witness, like not trying to witness, but of experiencing um, a particular form of divine presence
mm,
and to be made entirely new by it,
mm,
right? And like not in the cute, like, I don't know, makeover way, but in the like, your heart gets torn out of your chest and a new heart gets put in its place
mm,
way, right? It's quite, it's like I don't want to say that it's suffering, but it
mm,
is. And I don't want to say that it is terrible, but it is. And I
right.
don't want to say that it is amazing, but it is, right? There's like these
Mhm,
layers of these experiences that are extremely hard to talk about with anybody who doesn't have that shared experience because it's not about romanticizing or glorifying, but it's also not about dismissing or shrinking.
right.
There's a numinous quality to it. And even when I say the word numinous, it sounds like soft and like angelic. And it's like, yeah, man, angels will fuck your shit up.
Right.
Gods will fuck you up.
Mhm,
And if you're lucky, if you're fortunate, if you have a good head on your shoulders, if you have the resources, like not just funny money
mm,
resources, but like other forms of resources, like on the other side of your fucked upness is a form of yourself you could not have achieved otherwise.
Right. I am reminded of a tweet that you sent out the other day relating
Mm.
Saturn and Jupiter as like coaches.
Mm.
And that really reminds me of thinking of Jupiter only as growth in kind of like a good way. And I'm reminded of this idea of like, I mean, just to summarize what you said, like a spiritual experience can be a moment of deep personal crisis,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
sometimes for things to grow, things have to get broken down to be
Right.
rebuilt. And so there is an element to the growth process of falling apart.
Yeah. I mean, I'm reminded like the landscapey people on my property, like there's
Mm-hmm.
some beautiful rose bushes on my property. For whatever reason, they decided today is the day to do the winter pruning of the rose bushes. So these bushes that were like taller than me and that still had blooms on them are now like knee height, just like completely just like shorn.
Yeah.
And for roses, you have to prune them. They have to be kind of aggressively pruned for their own health.
Right. If you didn't know better, you would think these
It
people
was just
just killed these roses for no
right.
reason.
Or it's just like a brutality, right? Just like
Right.
brutal pruning. And those roses, like I'm pretty sure those roses in the ground are like at least 30 years old
Mm-hmm.
and they're very healthy.
Right. I think my experience, I think of Jupiter is that there may be this crisis moment, but as you alluded to in that tweet, like Jupiter really will kind of comfort you through it
Mm-hmm.
if you can make contact.
And if you can, I think part of it with Jupiter is you have to like Jupiter demands trust. And I would say
Mm,
12th house luminaries also demand a certain kind of trust. I can't I can't see, quote unquote, my sun and my moon, but I know that they're there and I know that other people perceive them.
mm,
And sometimes knowing that other people perceive them makes me extremely uncomfortable and want to just go hide. And also, like other people seeing in me what I cannot see in me is why I've been able to accomplish what I've accomplished.
mm.
And so there is, like I understand, like I have significant Jupiter privilege.
Yeah.
And that is going to make my 12th house luminary experience very different from somebody else's.
Right.
But there's something there of can you gather enough strength to trust the path, to trust the process, and then to be as best you can an active participant in the path and the process.
I'm reminded of your 12th house lecture and this
Mm-hmm.
idea of like, can you trust that you'll be able to see in the dark?
Yep. Can you trust your non-vision senses? You can't see, but you can hear, you can taste, you can smell, you can touch. You get that sixth sense spidey, like, oh, I think something is watching me.
Mm-hmm.
And then can you hone that sixth sense, something is watching me, into, and are they watching with hostility or kindness?
Yeah.
And I think so much of the training around the 12th house for me is that discernment of, it's like even going back to the instincts versus nervous system activation conversation. Um, like can you hone your perception, hone your discernment so you're not just cutting things off because it's uncomfortable, because you need to be able to know what is potentially growth inducing discomfort and potential harm inducing discomfort. And
Yes.
sometimes they feel the same.
Right.
Another kind of Jupiterian thing I think about a lot, especially as a 12th house person and a Saturnian person. And my entire life has been a Pluto conjunction transit person, which is that we're not obliged to make meaning or learn from any experience in our lives,
Mm.
but we can. And sometimes giving yourself the grace of making meaning out of something, like that's one of the most potent fertilizers you can give yourself.
Mm. Absolutely. I feel like that is a great segue to our last question, which is about the moon and your spiritual practice. So, what role does the moon play in your spiritual practice? And if so, how at all do you use the moon's cycles?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
So,
I think a part of that too
yeah.
is what suggestions would you have for someone who's maybe new to astrology or planetary relationship
Mhm.
in forming or initiating a relationship with the moon?
Yeah. So, um, one of the beautiful things about the moon is because she is so visible everywhere all the time, you know, like except for her few nights of being totally dark. Um, is that even if you don't pay attention to anything else in the sky, like the moon's patterns, the moon's cycles, um, give shape to time and give shape to
Mm-hmm.
qualities of time. Like it just is true that ERs are more crazy during full moons, you know, whenever that lunar energy is at its strongest. And especially inside of a culture where there isn't a lot of training on how to manage
Mm-hmm.
and navigate lunar energy productively or
Mm-hmm.
successfully or, in ways that feel subjectively pleasant.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and also in a culture where there's insufficient support for people who do not meet the criterion of hyper productive and contributive member of capitalism.
Yeah.
Right, like the full moons can be quite hard, but in any case, like the moon's patterns, the moon's cycles are visible to anyone everywhere. And like in my own practices, I have kind of a cautious, sometimes very deeply in relationship. I have like a dysregulated attachment to the moon, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
um at the same time, whenever I do go to the moon, I find her extremely responsive, very present. um like I have a little moon altar. I collect rocks and seashells for her. I give her milk or cheese, water.
Mm-hmm.
um I will drink mugwort tea and blue lotus tea as part of engaging with the non-rational dreamy spaces. And I found actually that, this is less spiritual but more magical, like actually working with the lunar cycles as a part of whatever it is you're trying to grow, whatever it is you are trying to prune,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it's extremely, extremely, extremely effective. Like I remember the very first sort of lunar magic thing that I did several years ago. Um, and then like I did it actually at a Capricorn new moon. And then at the Capricorn full moon that summer, I went back in my notebook. Every single part of my intentions from the Capricorn new moon were met, right? And there's something very respect inducing, awe
Mm-hmm.
inducing about that awareness of like lunar influence is not small thing. It's not small change,
Right.
right? And so I think for me, one of the important things when it comes to engaging in a relationship with any planet actually is to understand that the relationship is not one of like asking for shit and getting it,
I love this. Yeah.
right? It's one of engaging with the significations and virtues of that planet
Mm-hmm.
and being an active participant in cultivating those virtues in your own life in some way,
Yeah.
right? And so it's like even thinking about like, okay, it was a new moon in Capricorn, and like this was before I knew that I was a Sag rising. Or that I was a Cap rising, excuse me. I thought I was
Yeah.
still a Sag rising at the time. And like the things that I was trying to pursue were things that had to do with like increasing um the life in my spiritual practices,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because at that point I thought Capricorn was my 12th house, right?
Okay.
So I was trying to increase my dreaming, if I'm remembering correctly, right? I was trying to increase my dreaming, trying to increase my spiritual life, trying to increase my like the structures that facilitate positive growth in those areas. And I had some like specific other requests in that. And it's just like, okay, I'm asking for growth, I'm asking for nourishment, right? I'm asking for healthy spiritual relationship. Those are
Mm-hmm.
all the moon's purview, right? At the time, that wasn't why I was thinking about it. I was thinking about it as a 12th house thing, not a moon thing.
Right.
But when I think about it as a moon thing, it makes even more sense, you know?
Absolutely.
So, it's like the same thing with like Jupiter engagement, Jupiter stuff. It's just like I want to be able to be even more generous than I am, because I love being generous so much. Like it's one of my favorite things. Like my friend's having a hard time. Hey, can I buy you dinner? Yes, cool. I'm Venmoing you enough money to get enough food from your favorite place that you don't have to think about cooking for the next 2 days. Like that
Yes.
is my favorite thing.
I love
You
doing
know?
things that are so easy for me, but are so meaningful
Mm-hmm.
for another person to receive.
Yeah, exactly. It's like when I'm engaging with Venus, it's like I would like to increase people's capacities to be in relationship, right? So it's like my Venus prayers are like that's the prayer. The prayer is maybe also like it would be really cool if like this one perfumer decided to send me free perfume. That would be sick. But it is also like how do I help other people access beauty and relating?
Yeah.
you know and so like with the moon, it's like if somebody's like, how do I have a relationship with the moon? It's like, one, literally just go outside and say hi whenever she's visible. Like go outside, say hi, wait for it.
Yeah.
Right. I know not everybody receives communication in the ways that I do. We're different people.
Right.
But just saying hi and being able to uh start moving your worldview towards one where it is not only possible but completely natural
Yeah.
to be in relationship with the planetary people who interact with us, who interact with humans, who have influence upon human existence and more than human existence here in this special little corner of the universe. Like doing lunar things also is something to participate in as a way of getting to know the moon. For me, it's like I have a moon in Sagittarius. So moving my body, right? Like
Right.
going for a walk is part of my lunar, like literally daily lunar experiences. Um, it's like the moon likes cheese. I can't eat cow cheese, but I can eat sheep cheese and goat cheese. Do I eat cheese? And I think about how cheese is so delicious and such like a nutritious and compact way to get nutrients. Like, oh, God bless.
Yeah.
Right. Um, there's so many little ways
Right.
that you can engage with the moon. The important thing is to be like, I'm doing this because moon.
Right. To be intentional.
And then to do some amount of reflection. Oh, reflection. Does the moon reflect the sun's light? Reflection is literally a lunar activity in
Yeah.
a very real way. And so to do a lunar thing, like eat a piece of cheese while thinking about the moon, reflecting on the moon, right? Or if you want to set up a moon altar, especially if you can set up a moon altar somewhere in your house where you can see the moon, like a window or something, that's cool.
Yes.
Like look at the moon, give the moon some cheese, eat some cheese, hang out with the moon and the cheese. Think
Yeah.
about moon stuff, see what happens.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you so much for telling us a little bit about your practice. One of the things that you got me thinking about was something I've been thinking about since the conversation I had with Erin. What she said to kind of summarize was like, if you feed the moon will feed you. Like if you nourish the moon and you ask, just if you ask, the moon will nourish you and the moon will feed you. And I've been thinking about how I've been thinking about the Claus course as well. Like this idea of like talking about Santa Claus on social media. And because again, like in the spiritual circles that I've kind of run with, and I don't agree with all the ideas that are talked about, but there is this kind of talk about God, the word they use is God, as not being like Santa Claus, which you kind of touch on this idea of like, you don't just ask for stuff and you get it, and then like it's a transactional relationship, which is part of why I think the work that you're doing is so important. And like in conversations, we've really talked about how important the relationship is with these beings rather than like, oh, what are you going to use this thing for? Like, what are you going to use this planetary alignment for? Like, what are you going to get? Like, how are you going to relate? But with that said, like I think it's important to preface it in that way, because I do think that the moon, in my experience, has been so generous and so responsive. Maybe in comparison, I do a thing with Mercury every day where I make Mercury coffee when I'm making myself coffee. And like I'm starting to develop my relationship with Mercury as I go into this Virgo perfection year that I'm going into. But like, I feel like I've been a little bit more hit or miss with my kind of rituals around the moon. And that said, every time I do it, it feels so nourishing and feels so like productive, for
Mhm.
lack of a better term. And I don't like to use it that way because I do not want to relate to the moon in that way. I want to relate to the
Mhm.
moon on the moon, like on that being's terms, not to get something out of it, but it does feel very powerful.
Yeah, you know how you just said it feels so good to give something that's easy for you to give and that's
Mm-hmm.
so well received and important to the other person?
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the things that I think is true for especially the more like generosity leaning planets like Jupiter and the
Mm-hmm.
moon.
Mm-hmm.
Like the delight is in giving something that is meaningful to the recipient. And so to be given the opportunity to give something that is meaningful to the recipient is meaningful to the giver,
Yeah.
right? It doesn't have to be transactional. It's not being like, hey, moon, I'm giving you cheese. So now you should give me lucid dreaming.
Mm-hmm.
Deal, right?
Yeah.
It's like, hey, moon, I respect you. I love you. You're so great. There's something that you're skilled with that I would like to experience. I would really like to experience more lucid dreaming. I don't
Mm-hmm.
actually want to do that. Don't listen to me right now, moon. Um, dreams are cool, but I don't need to be awake when I'm asleep. Um so I don't know, maybe I do. But like that's something that's just like, oh, that would be meaningful for you. Great, let me see what I can do. Versus like, are you trying to buy me off with cheese?
Mm.
I really like cheese if you all don't.
If that's not obvious. Yeah.
I love cheese so much.
It's so good.
It's so good. But yeah, I think it's important to recognize that like whenever we ask beings who have a history of being helpful to humans to be helpful, we're giving them the opportunity to be helpful. And
Mm.
if we're asking from a place of like sincerity and humility and I'm coming to you because you're the expert in this kind of energy
Mhm.
versus give me the thing energy, even if the result is similar, like they're not actually similar because with one of them you're like, I actually want to be in deep engagement with this, and the
Mhm.
other is I want to consume this.
Yeah. Yeah. And while the result could be the same, it's a very different
Hmm.
qualitative difference between
Yeah,
how that body is engaged with.
right. And like referencing Too Hot to Handle again, like it's really sweet how like as complicated as I feel about that show, it's really sweet how like at the end, like there's that couple that's like, it doesn't matter if we win the money because what we won was each other. We won a
Mm.
relationship and like we're coming out of this like we might as well have won $1 million, like kind of
Mhm.
energy.
Mhm.
And I think that's one of the things that's like, if you do like lunar magic just to like get shit, you're going to get shit because the energy of the moon is the energy of the moon, and that energy can be very effective.
Yeah.
But if you make a relationship with the moon, you may or may not get shit, but you win because you have a
Mm.
relationship with the moon.
Yeah. Such a perfect place, I think, to end it.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
About the moon?
Yeah, anything that maybe we didn't say? We've
I
said a
don't think
lot,
so.
but
I mean, yeah, there's always so much. I mean, this is one of the things that I love about astrology is you're never ever going to run out of things to learn. Thank God, right? Like, it's no such
Mhm.
thing as boredom when it comes to astrology.
Well, where can we find you? And is there anything that you're working on right now that you want to tell us about?
Yeah, so you can find me at dianaroseharper.com. You can find me on the social mediums as at Damashina, which is hard to spell, but there will be links in the show notes. And anything I'd like to plug. I mean, I am actually part of my practice, like 12th housing, right, is like letting myself have actual like kind of downtime between projects. So I don't currently have anything that's in process that I can talk about yet. But for people who are listening, as you already mentioned, like I have a lecture on it's called Lamps in the Dark, and it's on Luminaries in the 12th house. It's an experimental, experiential kind of guided meditation lecture combo. That's not so much learning about, like book learning about luminaries in the 12th, but what does it mean to have luminaries in the 12th, and kind of if you don't have them, like a sort of weird experience that might help to replicate the experience for you. So if that's something that you'd be interested in, there's that. And then I also have 6 other lectures and workshops, I think, currently available on my website. You can learn about all of them on my website and also buy them there. Yeah, I think that's it. And then, the things that I'm working on, one of them I'm very excited about, that will probably I'll be announcing in like February or so.
Awesome.
And if you want the easiest way to get access to that whenever I'm talking about it is by joining my newsletter, which you can do on my website.
Wonderful. I want to say really quickly before we end, I did your 12th house workshop, like I talked about in the introductory episode for this podcast, and I really did have a pretty amazing experience. So I would highly suggest that to anybody that doesn't have 12th house luminaries and wants a more in-depth experience of the 12th house. I will also say for those who are interested in more book learning, I found your first house, second house workshop, especially as it relates to signs and this modality element planetary ruler scheme. I found it to be very helpful in breaking down the signs and really understanding them. So I would definitely suggest that. And I also just want to say, become a patron of Diana. Go to Patreon and become her patron. It's important that we support people's work and give them the opportunity to rest. And there's also a lot of amazing resources on the other side of becoming a patron that I know that people would value. So I'll put all that stuff in the show notes. And I just want to say again, thank you so much for doing this, Diana. It's been a really wonderful experience to talk to you about your experience of the moon.
Thank you. It's I love having conversations with you, and I'm really glad that now multiple other people get to listen in on our conversation.
Yeah, me too. All right, talk to you soon.
All right, bye.
Thanks for listening to the show. I'll see you next time. To find a transcript of this episode, please subscribe to my Substack, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcast or Spotify. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. Please feel free to follow me there and let me know that you found me from listening to the show. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to the websites of the astrologers and other resources that I mentioned in this episode, as well as links to the cover art and the intro and outro music. Thanks. See you next time.